Imagine being completely in the dark, in the middle of a storm. No light, no sound, just silence. But something is out there, watching. You hear footsteps, whispers in the wind, and fear begins to take over. What would you do if, the moment the lights went out, a sinister figure appeared in your garden, and you couldn't escape anymore? Stay until the end, because what happened that night will send chills down your spine. And you'll never look at a blackout the same way again. The house, once so welcoming and bright, was now turning into a nightmare scene. It was just any other night, but the weather felt strange. The storm outside seemed to intensify with each passing minute, and the distant sound of thunder caused growing discomfort. Suddenly, the light flickered once, and then everything went out. Silence took over the environment, but it wasn't the peaceful silence of an empty house. It was an oppressive silence, swallowing every small sound. The protagonist, now immersed in total darkness, felt a shiver run down his spine. What had seemed like just a temporary blackout, a power failure caused by the storm, now felt like something more, something he couldn't identify. He took a deep breath, trying to push away the rising fear, and searched for a flashlight in the kitchen drawer. His fingers fumbled through the shelves, but the feeling that something was about to happen wouldn't let him rest. When he turned on the flashlight, a small sphere of light danced before his eyes. He spun it around, illuminating the room. Everything seemed normal, but the feeling that the darkness now harbored something else was relentless. Fear was palpable. Something seemed to be moving in the shadows. He tried to convince himself it was just his mind playing tricks, but the tension in the air was undeniable. That's when he heard it, a muffled sound. Slow, heavy footsteps, as if something was dragging itself across the floor. The protagonist froze, the flashlight trembling in his hands. He held his breath, his eyes scanning the dark room for the source of the sound. But the house was empty. No one was there. The tension grew unbearably, and the feeling of being watched intensified with every passing second. The discomfort grew. The sound of footsteps, which had seemed like a figment of his imagination, was now clearer. Closer. The protagonist moved towards the window, flashlight in hand, lighting up the garden outside. But when he looked, he saw nothing at first, only the dense darkness that engulfed the yard. The wind howled, and the trees swayed violently, but the figure he felt was there was no longer visible. He forced himself to look away, trying to calm his nerves. That's when he saw it. The figure was there, on the edge of the flashlight's light, with its back turned, motionless, as if waiting for something. He blinked several times, unable to believe what he was seeing. The figure seemed completely still, just standing there, shoulders slightly hunched. What troubled him the most, however, wasn't the presence itself, but the feeling that it was out of sync with the reality around it. Something about that figure felt wrong. The protagonist, paralyzed, watched in silence, feeling his stomach turn. The wind, which had been strong and biting until then, suddenly ceased. An absolute silence fell over the house, as if the world around him had stopped existing. He took a step towards the back door, intending to go out and confront whatever that thing was. But the moment he turned the doorknob, the figure vanished. Where it had been, there was now nothing but darkness, swallowing the garden once again. He stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Anguish took over him. It was as if the figure wasn't physically there anymore, but had become part of the environment, a presence hanging, ready to reappear at any moment. What he felt wasn't just fear, but an indescribable sensation that if he tried to move forward, something would stop him. Something far larger and older than any ordinary fear. After the appearance in the garden, the tension inside the house seemed to become a tangible presence, more oppressive than before. The protagonist felt something was wrong, but he couldn't explain what exactly. He tried to rationalize, but every small power flicker or strange sound felt like a reminder that he wasn't alone. However, the worst was yet to come, something he never imagined finding in that place. Tired of the darkness, he moved away from the window and walked to the living room. where the old tube radio was stored on the shelf. For some inexplicable reason, the idea of turning on the radio seemed like the only way to bring some normalcy back. Perhaps it was a desire to hear human voices, something to ease the sense of isolation. He approached the radio and turned the dial, trying to tune into a news or music station to break the tension. However, instead of a normal station, a strange, distorted sound began to play. The radio emitted a crackling sound, as if it were tuning into a lost station, but something in the air made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The sound was getting clearer, and suddenly he heard a voice, low and distorted, as if someone was speaking directly to him. He leaned closer, trying to understand the words, but what he heard was so unsettling that he almost gave up on listening. "You are being watched. You are not safe here. They are coming." Shock ran down his spine, and a wave of panic took over him. The radio, which had been just an attempt to find something familiar, now seemed like a window into a reality he didn't want to understand. The voice continued, repeating the same words, clearer each time, as if it were coming from inside the house itself, not the radio. Terrified, the protagonist looked around. The feeling that something was about to be revealed was unbearable. But before he could react, the sound stopped abruptly, and silence returned with even more force, as if he had been swallowed by an invisible presence. He quickly turned off the radio, but the fear didn't leave. In his mind, the voice continued to echo, like a warning he didn't know how to ignore. Something was very wrong, and he felt that the blackout, which had seemed like a simple power failure, was turning into something far more sinister. After the incident with the radio, the protagonist was beginning to feel that the house, which had always been his refuge, was now becoming a strange and hostile place. He forced himself to stay calm, trying to rationalize that maybe it was just his mind playing tricks due to the stress of the storm. But then, as he walked through the house, a new sensation overtook him, the feeling that he was no longer alone. The sound came first as a faint creak, almost imperceptible. The kind of sound you could easily ignore if you were distracted. But the protagonist wasn't distracted. The tension in the house was too thick to ignore any noise. He turned, his eyes fixing on the staircase leading to the upper floor of the house. Was there something or someone up there? With his heart racing, he began to slowly ascend the stairs, each step echoing in the deep silence of the house. As he neared the top, the sound became clearer, a metallic, irregular noise, as if something was being dragged across the floor. The protagonist froze. The sound was coming from the second-floor hallway, but the house was empty. There was no one else there. With a flashlight in hand, he cautiously advanced down the dark hallway. The sound continued, but it didn't come from one single place. It seemed to move, as if something were being shifted from one room to another. The feeling of being followed, watched, and waiting to be caught intensified with each passing second. He turned the doorknob of the first door he found and quickly entered the room. Inside, nothing seemed out of place. The bed was neatly made, and the air was so heavy it felt like nothing had moved there in years. But the sound was still there. Now it was closer. He looked toward the corner of the room, and that's when he saw it. The weight of a chair being moved, as if it were being pushed toward him, without anyone touching it. The chair, which had once been in a distant corner, was now in the middle of the room, tilted awkwardly. The dragging sound continued, and he could feel the presence of something. Something that shouldn't be there. Something that didn't belong to this world. Fear wrapped around him so tightly that he could no longer distinguish reality from illusion. Then a door opened, silently, as if someone had been waiting to be invited in. But no one appeared. He smelled a sweet odor in the air, as if he were breathing in fear itself. Something was about to happen, but he didn't know what. And worse, he didn't know if he would survive whatever was coming next. The house, now filled with an even deeper silence, seemed to be waiting for something. The protagonist felt as though time had stopped. The tension was almost unbearable, and he knew the worst was about to happen, but he couldn't understand exactly what. He tried to leave, but the moments passed slowly, as if the house were turning into a maze with no way out. It was as though the blackout wasn't just a power outage, but a fall into another dimension, a place where the rules of reality no longer applied. Then the lights flickered again, as if the house were about to come back to life. He rushed to the fuse box to try to restore the power, but when he touched the switch, the surroundings briefly lit up and then went dark again. And it wasn't just the lights. The entire air seemed to be sucked into a vortex. It felt as if for a moment the house was about to be swallowed by something much bigger than him. At that moment, he heard a new sound, a crackle coming from the light above him. But it was a frequency so low and disturbing that it felt like it was cutting through his brain. The sound was enveloping, growing louder, until he felt as though he were being engulfed by an invisible beam of electricity. His ears began to ring, and he, now completely hopeless, knew that nothing would make sense anymore. When the lights finally came on, he looked around the room and saw nothing. No figure, no movement, no sound. Just the absolute void. But as he looked closer, a dark shadow quickly passed across the wall. It wasn't a person, but something that shouldn't exist. A shapeless shadow, without outlines, that seemed to have a consciousness of its own. Something he could no longer comprehend. Before he could react, the lights flickered again, and in the blink of an eye, the blackout returned. But this time, he was no longer in the safety of his own home. He was in a dark and cold place, with no signs of life, and the only thing he felt was a threatening presence closing in. He didn't know if he was alive or if he had been taken to some kind of purgatory. But one thing was certain: the house, and perhaps the blackout itself, would never be more than a prelude to something much more sinister. Something beyond human understanding. After the final blackout, a dense and suffocating darkness completely overtook the environment. The house, which once seemed like a familiar place, was now unrecognizable. The protagonist was disoriented, his body tense, and his mind completely confused. He tried to call for help, but his voice sounded muffled, as if trapped in a bubble of silence. He began to move slowly, searching for any clue, something that could help him understand what was happening. But as he walked, the feeling of being watched intensified, and soon he realized he was no longer alone. It was then that he felt the touch, a cold, icy hand that gripped his shoulder, paralyzing him instantly. He froze, unable to move, unable to scream. The hand seemed to have no flesh, but something far more macabre, a presence that wasn't physically there, but that surrounded him completely, making him feel as if his body were being pierced by a malevolent energy. The heavy, labored breathing of someone or something could be heard right behind him. He turned quickly, but there was no one. The house's darkness seemed to swallow any trace of life. With his heart racing, he moved forward, his steps echoing through the silent hallway. When he passed by a broken window, he saw something that made him stop immediately. In the reflection of the glass, he noticed a figure, a low, indistinct shadow, but with human outlines, lurking in the back of the house. The figure was motionless, watching him with a disturbing calm, and the feeling of being observed by something beyond human took over his soul. He tried to return to the lower floor, but as he descended the stairs, an invisible force seemed to pull him back. He tried to free himself, but the pressure increased with every passing second, as if the house were trying to hold him, as if it were alive and determined to keep him within its walls forever. Fear consumed him, and he knew it wouldn't be easy to escape. But what happened next left him speechless. Suddenly, the lights came on again, and the house was bathed in a cold, almost ethereal glow. But what he saw before him was something he couldn't understand. There was a door at the end of the hallway, a door that hadn't been there before, but now seemed to invite him. Something was drawing him to it. Without thinking, he approached, and when he touched the doorknob, it turned easily. But what he saw when he opened the door was not what he expected. Inside, the room was pristine, but the air was cold and heavy. He approached, and when he looked in the mirror, his own image stared back at him. But for a moment, he didn't recognize himself. Something had changed in his eyes. A shadow that hadn't been there before. A mark of something deep and mysterious. A feeling of alienation and despair overtook him. And then the voice came back. The same voice from the radio. "You knew, didn't you? You've been part of this from the beginning." Before he could process the words, everything went dark again. The blackout engulfed him, but this time, he knew it was no longer just a power failure. The house, now, had consumed him irreversibly. The darkness overtook the house again, but this time it was different. The pressure in the air was palpable, as if time had stopped, and the protagonist was trapped in a continuous nightmare. He felt a presence getting closer, a weight settling in his soul, making it hard to breathe. Something was there, but he couldn't see it. It wasn't just a shadow, it was the absence of light, as if the house were being swallowed by something greater, something that didn't belong to reality. With every step he took, the fear grew, and he knew there was no escape. The worst was still to come, but he couldn't imagine what it would be. He started running, his footsteps echoing through the empty hallway. But the faster he ran, the stronger the feeling of being followed became. When he looked back, he saw the shadow, but it wasn't an ordinary shadow. It seemed to twist, expanding and contracting as if it had a life of its own. The house was alive. This was no longer just a blackout or a paranormal event. It was a being that fed on his energy, on his fear. With every breath he took, the house seemed to close in around him. The winds howled through the cracks in the walls, and the feeling of suffocation became unbearable. It was as if he were being sucked into the very darkness. The protagonist no longer knew where he was, but he knew the house was changing. The walls moved, the floors creaked as if they were alive, and he felt the weight of something invisible pressing against his skin. He looked ahead, desperate for an exit, but the only thing he found was the staircase leading to the attic, a place he had never been before, but now seemed like the only possible refuge. He hurried up the stairs, not looking back, not stopping. But when he reached the top, the moonlight filtered through a small window, illuminating a figure in the corner of the room. It wasn't a person, but an indistinct shape, a shadow with human-like outlines, but with an inhuman presence. It watched him, its empty eyes reflecting the light as if they were bottomless pits. He tried to move away, but something held him back. His mind was in panic, and he could no longer tell if he was dreaming or if this was real. What he felt next was something no one should ever experience. The shadow's hands enveloped him, and he felt his life being drained, not physically, but spiritually, as if his soul were being torn from his body. And as the light faded, he heard the voice once again, "You were the chosen one." The last thing he saw was the shadow's face coming closer, its dark eyes filling his entire field of vision, until everything turned completely black. The silence that followed was absolute, a silence so deep it seemed to have swallowed even his thoughts. When the darkness dissipated, the protagonist was no longer in the attic. He found himself in a strange, distorted place, where the walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. It was as if he had been transported to another plane, a space that didn't belong to any place he knew. Shadows danced around him, distorted and threatening, as if they were alive. He tried to stand, but his body felt heavy, as if it were part of the very environment. The air was dense, charged with a pressure that seemed to crush his chest. He didn't know if he was in a nightmare or experiencing some kind of altered perception, but one thing he knew for sure: he was no longer alone. Something was watching him, something that wasn't human, but that had hungry eyes, as if waiting for his next reaction. Suddenly, the lights came on again, but not in the way he expected. They weren't ordinary lamps, but a pulsating, cold light emanating from the walls and floor. The shadows receded, but the light only highlighted the presence of figures he hadn't seen before. They were around him, seeming human at first, but their faces were distorted, with expressions of pain and despair. The protagonist couldn't understand what was happening, But as these figures drew closer, he felt a wave of cold, a sense of imminent death. He tried to scream, but his voice was trapped, as if the house itself had stolen his ability to express himself. He was being surrounded by these entities, these presences that were no longer human, but fed on something much deeper: his fear, his anguish. The figures began to murmur in a strange language, one that seemed to come from ancient times, an incomprehensible and unsettling sound. Each word was like a blade cutting through his mind, and he felt his sanity starting to unravel. That's when he understood. He wasn't in a physical place. He was in a dimension created by his own mind, a dimension where the house was more than a building. It was a field of energy, fueled by the thoughts and fears of those who inhabited it. The fear he felt wasn't just his own, but that of all who had ever entered that house. All those who had been consumed, whose souls were trapped there, feeding the darkness that now surrounded him. He could no longer distinguish what was real and what was the invention of his mind. With every step he took, he felt the pressure increase, as if the house itself were trying to pull him inside, making him part of its eternal cycle of pain and suffering. Then, in the midst of all this, a familiar voice emerged, a voice he recognized immediately. The voice from the radio, the same one that had haunted him from the start. "You thought you could escape," it said, with a cold and threatening tone. "But the house will never let you go. You already belong to it, like everyone else before you." And with those words, the protagonist felt the last spark of hope extinguish, swallowed by the darkness that now completely surrounded him. The protagonist no longer knew where he was, or even who he was. His body seemed to have distorted along with the house, merging with the shadows and the cold that surrounded him. He could feel the presence of the entities around him, their twisted forms and empty eyes watching him with every movement. The sensation of being consumed by an ancient evil was inescapable. But something within him still fought to escape, to understand what had happened. He needed, somehow, to find an exit, or at least a reason for all of this. Then, in a moment of clarity, he saw a disturbing vision. A door in a dark corner of the room suddenly appeared before him. It was an old iron door, with marks of rust and deep scratches. But unlike the other doors that closed when he tried to open them, this one seemed to invite him. It was as if it had been waiting for his decision, as if it were the key to understanding what was happening. With a desperate impulse, he approached the door and, with difficulty, pushed the doorknob. It creaked, as if it had been stuck for centuries, but gave way, and he entered. The scene on the other side of the door left him speechless. He found himself in a narrow, old-looking corridor, with rusty wooden doors on either side. The air was thicker, as if time had stopped there many years ago. At the end of the corridor, something moved. It wasn't a figure, but something much more subtle, like a feeling of presence. He knew he wasn't alone. As he approached, the doors around him began to open, one after another, revealing strange, hooded figures with invisible faces. Their hands were outstretched, as if inviting the protagonist to join them. But he knew that if he did, his soul would be lost forever, just like the souls of all those who had been consumed by the house before him. He felt an invisible force anchoring his feet to the ground. He could no longer move, but he knew he couldn't give up. The figures began to approach, their presences becoming more intense, more tangible. He heard the whispers, the old and distorted voices, speaking of revenge, of a curse that had been cast generations ago. Every soul condemned to that house was searching for redemption, and now he was part of the cycle. He tried to resist, but the figures were too close. Every step towards him paralyzed him further, until he finally understood. He had been the last to enter the house. He was the chosen one to continue the cycle. He wasn't in a physical place, but in a dimension of torture, where the souls that had been consumed waited for their next victim. And what bound them was revenge. The revenge of those who, for some reason, had been forgotten, ignored, and now returned to consume the soul of anyone who dared enter their eternal prison. With a final scream of despair, the protagonist was consumed by the shadows, and the door closed behind him. The darkness took over his body, mind, and soul. He became another shadow in that house, another one condemned to the vengeance of the spirits that inhabited it. The house had finally completed its cycle, and yet another life had been destroyed. The clock marked the passage of time, but inside the house, time no longer existed. The darkness was absolute and eternal, and the screams echoing through the walls were the last memories of those who had entered and never left. The protagonist, now part of it all, could feel his energies torn apart, his mind slowly being erased, but a last spark of awareness remained, defying the absolute dominion of the shadows. He wandered in a state of semi-lucidity, shapeless, bodiless, a lost soul between the cracks of the material world and the hellish dimension where he was trapped. He felt the weight of the past, the souls of all those who had been consumed by the house, those who, like him, had been chosen to become part of it. They were with him, but they were no longer human. They were shadows, echoes of a forgotten time, bound by pain and suffering. But something was different at that moment. Something was about to happen. He felt an energy that didn't belong to that place, a vibration running through his soul, as if a last chance was being offered to him. He then realized that the house was not just a prison, it was also a test of endurance. He remembered something he had heard before in one of the many moments of clarity that had come to him during the journey. The house only frees those who can see beyond the darkness. With this in mind, he began to search within himself for the answers that needed to be found. There was no turning back. He knew the only way out would be to transcend his own pain and fear, to face what he feared most, his own essence. He had become a shadow, but a part of his humanity remained, and he would use it to finally escape. Meanwhile, the figures around him began to stir, as if they sensed his resistance. They didn't like the idea of a prisoner rebelling. The murmurs grew louder, the air grew colder, and the pressure on his body increased. With each passing second, he felt the darkness trying to devour him more and more. But then, in one last act of will, he closed his eyes and focused, seeking his true essence, his center. Suddenly, a light shone in the depths of the darkness. He didn't know where it came from, but he felt a wave of warmth and relief. The shadows began to dissolve, and the voices ceased. The house, which had until then seemed like a living entity, began to weaken. He didn't know if he was dying or if he was awakening, but the feeling of freedom was indescribable. Before the light consumed him completely, he heard one last voice, the same voice from the radio. You were the last. Now you are free, but the house will always call for you. And with that final message, everything went dark. The protagonist didn't know if he had escaped or if the cycle would repeat. But one thing he knew, he was now part of the house's history. He had become a legend, a shadow still lurking in the heart of the darkness. And who knows, one day, someone might enter that cursed place again, and he would be there waiting to continue the eternal cycle.